study of culture and society, this is BG Ideas.
I'm going to show you this with a wonderful experiment.
You're listening to the Big Ideas Podcast, a collaboration between the Institute for the Study of Culture and Society and the School of Media and Communication at Bowling Green State University. I'm Dave Lewis, the sound archivist and associate professor in the Music Library and Bill Shirk Sound Archives at BGSU. I'm sitting in today for Jolie Sheffer. As always, the opinions expressed on this podcast are those of the individuals involved and don't necessarily represent those of BGSU or its employees. Bowling Green State University and its campuses are situated in the Great Black Swamp in the lower Great Lakes region. This land is the homeland of the Wyandot, Kickapoo, Miami, Potawatomi, Odawa, and multiple other indigenous tribal nations, present and past, who were forcibly removed to and from the area. We recognize these historical and contemporary ties in our efforts towards decolonizing history, and we thank the indigenous individuals and communities who have been living and working on this land from time immemorial. Joining me in the studio today are BGSU student Jasmine Wilson and her faculty mentor, Dr. Jason Whitfield. Jasmine is a senior majoring in communication sciences and disorders and minoring in psychology. She hopes to go to graduate school for a master's in communication disorders and become a speech-language pathologist. Jason is an associate professor of communication sciences and disorders at BGSU with a focus on speech disorders. He has published extensively on Parkinson's disease, which affects a person's communication abilities. In the spring semester of 2022, Jasmine, with the help of her faculty mentor Jason, worked on a research project titled Perceptual Learning of African American English. This project was funded by the Center for Undergraduate Research and Scholarship, or CURS. CURS provides funding for undergraduate students to pursue research, scholarly or creative projects with a faculty mentor in their chosen discipline. So Jasmine, to start us off, could you introduce us to your project and talk a little bit about why you became interested in the topic?
Yeah, so our project is just using perceptual learning to see if we can get people to perceive a dialect that was different than their own. And we focused on African American English, just since it's like a more common dialect that people are familiar with distinguishing from standard American English. And I was interested in this topic because we read a paper about the George Zimmerman trial. And it talked about how a witness who testified against Zimmerman spoke with an AAE dialect. And because the court transcriber misunderstood her testimony was dismissed, which could have ultimately played out differently given that she was understood correctly.
Okay, so you mentioned AAE, or African American English. Could you all talk a little bit about how that differs from standard white American English?
So African American English is just a dialect variant that is used by, but not exclusively by, African Americans. And it's actually a source for a lot of slang terms that are used today. And the difference is just like morphological, like rules, such as like a habitual be or like a was substitution, and just like small rules like that can be hard to understand if you aren't too familiar.
Thanks. And Jason, could you talk a little bit about how you became involved with the project?
Yeah, so I've been quite interested for a long time in how race and other intersections of identity have been constructed and operate within the U.S. context. And I've had, the recent opportunity to include those conversations within kind of my academic life and scholarly life. I'm trained as a speech scientist, so I'm always interested in human communication and speech production, speech perception. And in a conversation with a colleague, they brought up some of these papers or prior studies that Jasmine mentioned that focused on the criminal legal system and how AAE as a dialect may be a source of discrimination that operates within that system. So one empirical study looked at court transcribers who typically have to be about 98 to 96 proficient or accurate at transcribing the speech of folks in courtrooms. And this study showed empirically that they were disproportionately worse at transcribing AAE. And so, that kind of hit at the intersection of some of the work I've done relative to speech perception. And so that kind of moved us into these conversations. And actually, Jasmine and I were, having these conversations very early on. And so she was really involved from the beginning, reading these papers together, talking about these ideas, and then coming up with the current study we're talking about.
Okay, great. Thanks. And Jasmine, could you talk about how that work relates directly to speech language pathology? So we talked about it, AA in the court system. So how did you make that bridge to your own area of study?
Yeah, so as a speech language pathologist, you're going to be working with a lot of different people with a lot of different dialects. So it's important to be able to distinguish whether someone just has a different dialect or if they actually have a speech language disorder. And I know in a lot of inner city schools, it's hard to a lot of people just assume that if you have a different dialect, then they have a different disorder, especially in the African American community.
Great, thanks. Anything to add, Jason?
Yeah, I think, Jasmine really characterized that well. Just another kind of broader perspective too. Speech language pathologists go through a wide range of training and credentialing to get to where they are. It requires a master's degree. But as, part of the kind of legacies of higher education and in our field, it's a very gendered and racialized profession. So, 95% of SLPs are women, and about 92% are white. The issues that Jasmine brings up are particularly important within that context where the SLP or speech language pathologist who's evaluating kids in the school system may be of a different race, ethnicity than the children that they're interacting with. So, we go to great lengths in our training programs to, cover the idea of language differences that may be cultural or racial, and as opposed to a true language delay or disorder that may need intervention.
Great, thanks. It seems like you've hit on a really interesting and timely area of research. But I'm curious about how the research actually went. So how did the collaborative process work? How did you two work together on this project? Jasmine, you want to start?
We first started by reading different papers and just getting more of a background as how African American English is, learning more about that and how it is as a social justice aspect. And then we kind of started getting ideas of how we could do a research project. So how we could actually get people to perceive it from standard American English. And so we started working spring 2021. So we've been working on it for about a year and a half now. So yeah, it was also during COVID, so a lot of it was virtual. So we didn't actually get into the lab until last fall, I think. So
Great. And Jason, what were your experiences of the collaboration?
Yeah, very, very similar, to the ideas Jasmine articulated, but just to kind of, frame it from a faculty perspective, I always so much enjoy working with students who are curious and willing to take risks on new topics or new endeavors, first time working with research. For me, my outcome measures and goals always tend to be, embedded within the journey and process in research. And so I enjoy seeing students ask questions, be curious, kind of go home, do the work, come back with new ideas. And so this study was very much like that. Often I have projects at various stages of developments, and students will kind of jump in the middle and really own a piece of that project. And this one just happened to be a little different. It was an area that, kind of came out of this curiosity in a conversation with a colleague, and Jasmine really was there from its inception of the ideas. I maybe bounced it off a few other colleagues before she and I talked, but so she's really shaped how the project has played out, which has just been really inspiring to see, and I think a unique, experience for undergrads to really see the, kind of research process from beginning to end.
Great, thanks. And on that note, How did the Center for Undergraduate Research play into this project? Like, how did they support it? Were there any benchmarks you had to meet along the way? How did they play into the research process?
Yeah, I've had several students, over my time here at BGSU, go through the CURS grant process, and I think it's just such a positive experience for students. To really take ownership and engage in a research project or a portion of a research project. And it is a formalized process that includes an application, and they make it pretty explicit what the review criteria are. I've served, obviously not for my own students, but I've served as a reviewer for CURS and other disciplines, and so I kind of know what it's like on the reviewer side as well. But it's a rigorous process where the student writes a proposal, crafts a proposal, has kind of a timeline for completing the work, and then has reports that are due at the end of the project, in order to kind of demonstrate the progress on that work. What's also great about it is CURS does have a annual symposium that occurs, I think, in April, in the spring semester, where students get to share their work. And so Jasmine will be doing that this year, since we had the grant last year.
So, Jasmine, you're a budding speech language pathologist. So how does this project fit into your ultimate career goals?
So, kind of how I said before, just like learning more about like different dialects and being aware of the difference between having a different dialect and a disorder. If I choose to work in a school, then obviously I'm going to be exposed to a lot of different students with like a lot of different backgrounds and like ethnic backgrounds, socioeconomic backgrounds. So it's important for me to be able to distinguish that and give the student who actually needs help in speech or language.
Yeah, thanks. That's great. And I think it also probably will give you a great jump on grad school applications, just having done this research already. Okay, so you mentioned COVID. That was, of course, a challenge. You can talk more about that. But what were some other challenges that you found during this research project, whether it was in the sort of beginning phase or in the implementation?
I guess just figuring out how to actually perform the study, and like we had a lot of different ideas of like what we could do. So I guess just trying to figure out the best way to perform it and how to get a good study sample.
Mhm. And so what kind of techniques did you land on? So how did you end up putting the study together?
So we made a survey on Qualtrics, and we put audio files from a online database, or two online databases, and we had participants kind of type what they heard from the audio recordings, and we had a section of where they just listened to like longer utterances, and then we retested them on different sample utterances to have them type what they heard to see if there was a difference from the pre-test and the post-test. And we put the Qualtrics survey onto a website called Prolific, which allows people from all over the US to be able to take the survey. And we actually got a lot of results in, I think, like 2 hours. I think we got everyone.
Yeah, it was that was a new shift for me. So I was, familiar with these type of learning paradigms, and the one we used is relatively simple. And Jasmine mentioned that. So we kind of did this pre-test, post-test, where they were just transcribing the speech of Black talkers from this AAE database. But in the middle, the learning, so to speak, was really implicit. So we would, it's akin to turning on the subtitles if you're having trouble understanding a show on Netflix or something like that. So we play the samples and then provide them with a written transcript of what's being said. And just the process of pairing the, speech signal with the known linguistic context allows listeners to make the connections in their brain between the different phonological and linguistic patterns these talkers are using, and so we saw the improvement. But relative to the technical side of things, the implementation here was quite new for us. At least in my lab, we hadn't done this type of work before. We've done perceptual studies using other software, but getting Qualtrics to do exactly what we want was a bit of a challenge. And I think that's where we took the longest time. Jasmine spent many hours embedding audio within that and making sure we were controlling for different things and measuring, how long they spent on each screen. And then the Prolific website was a saver for sure, and is something also new. It's kind of one of these crowdsourced survey platforms where you pay participants, and that's what we use the CURS funding for to do the study. And as Jasmine said, we finally got it launched about halfway through the duration of her project, and we're like, oh, we hope we get the data quickly, and it ended up coming in 2 or 3 hours. Posted it at 4 o'clock, and it was all done by 7 p.m. that night. So that part is something I'm not quite used to. We've done a lot more of, bringing participants into our lab and kind of the longer process there that tends to take a month or two. So that for me was a big shift just in the time allocation at different phases of the research.
Great, thanks. We're going to take a quick break. Thank you for listening to the Big Ideas Podcast.
Question. Answer. Discussion.
If you are passionate about big ideas, consider sponsoring this program. To have your name or organization mentioned here, please contact us at ics@bgsu.edu.
Hello, and welcome back to the Big Ideas Podcast. Today, I'm talking to Dr. Jason Whitfield and Jasmine Wilson about their research project on perceptual learning of African American English. This project was funded by the Center for Undergraduate Research and Scholarship, or CURS. Before the break, you were talking about the design of your study and kind of giving people training wheels to understand and transcribe African American English better. About how much practice did people need to see an improvement?
That's a good question. That wasn't a parameter that we studied necessarily. We set it as just kind of a constant across all participants. So that was one of those early discussions. How do we really play this out? And so we went back to prior research. There's actually a rich history of research in perceptual learning like this, whether it's learning, to understand talkers with a different dialect or accent from another language, a second language they're speaking, or other forms of learning. And so we went with kind of a standard amount of time there. So I think it was, maybe just 10 minutes or so of this type of thing. So it was, pretty wild and slow. And I don't think we necessarily had everyone have huge improvements, but we did at least show that this measure there was some sensitivity, and that folks were understanding better just after this very small exposure. And so it's something I've always been, I've seen these data before, and I'm always kind of blown away by how quickly listeners can just adapt their perceptual, skills to meet their talker where they are, so to speak.
Yeah, that's great. So Jasmine, after you'd sort of finished the literature review and you were starting the project, what did you hope would come out of it? What were your goals for the project?
I guess just to see if there would be an improvement in people and see if they would be able to perceive different dialects. But I guess the ultimate goal would be for everyone to kind of be exposed to different dialects, especially if they're working as a court transcriber or a SLP or just anywhere working with a lot of different people, or you would need to be able to understand.
Great, thanks. And Jason, did you have any other goals for the project?
Those I think cover most of my goals for the project. As a general goal, I have always strive to include students in my research. So I like to include, goals and objectives just around student learning and experience. But other than that, it's to even, as we've kind of branched out in this work to contribute meaningfully to at least the conversation and the literature, even if it is just kind of a small step in a positive direction.
And that's kind of all research, right? All research is some tiny step. But about that tiny step, what are some of the implications you see in this research? How could it impact the communities that you were working with?
It's just beneficial to know, to just understand people in general and to, I guess, in a speech field just to understand whether they actually have like a disorder or if they just have a different dialect, and to like just be aware of that difference and know that just because someone has a different dialect doesn't necessarily mean they have a speech disorder.
Hmm. Yeah, I would say the same thing of, the idea of recognizing difference versus maybe disorder or delay in our school age populations. And then beyond that, there may be a need if we, see these disparities persisting and having real material implications to create kind of thresholds or training programs so that our, credentialed professionals, whether they're SLPs or court transcribers, reach levels of proficiency of understanding these different dialects. And AAE's, one dialect, but there are a lot of dialects that folks may interact with. And the one other aspect I think we talked about early on that I think valued in this design was this design really puts the kind of work on the kind of dominant white stream talker. So rather than asking, folks who use these marginalized linguistic dialects to shift and assimilate, it's really saying, no, let's work to better understand, the full diversity of our society.
If there are faculty members listening at BGSU or elsewhere, what would you all want them to know about student-faculty partnerships on research projects like this? What are some tips that you might give people starting this kind of work? Jasmine?
I guess just if you have a faculty member that is working in an area that you're particularly interested in, to reach out and see if they are looking for student researchers. I feel like most of the time they want students to come in and help them, so it shouldn't be like too difficult to try to convince them. I say it's nice to have a faculty member that you've been working with, just so that you like can get like an insight to like research, or just, to have someone to go to, like even outside of research for like other academic things. But yeah, it's just nice to have like a support system outside of like just your friends or like other peers for academic needs, and getting into research kind of helps build that relationship with faculty members.
Yeah, I think part of that is kind of what the undergrad experience is all about, right? You have all these great, smart people. Yeah, definitely utilize them. Jason, what about you? What tips would you give either faculty or students in starting a project like this?
Yeah, I would say I, have followed the lead of folks in my department. I would say that we work really hard to involve students in research, meet them where they are, and kind of cultivate that at least interest, if not love, in the research process. It's something that I think has been core to our discipline, and so I would say, definitely involve it, and as much as we can. I know as faculty, we're balancing a lot of different competing demands. But, as much as we can, kind of working with the students and their interests where they lie, and finding where we have common interests and topics and research ideas. And then really, kind of working as a mentor to help that student grow in their ability to question and think critically. And so that's, and think through these decisions. And so that's why I do it. And that's why I like being here, is because of how much, really at every level, the undergrad, master's, and doctoral level, I get to interact with students, particularly surrounding research.
Great, thanks. So returning to your research project for a little bit, what do you see as some next steps for this project, whether or not they're next steps that you're going to undertake yourself? So are there avenues of research this has opened up, things you might do, Jasmine, in your master's program, or are there more sort of practical on-the-ground applications that you see that might come out of this?
Well, I definitely see myself continuing with this, and I know that we are still working on this with the Falls Curves grant, and we are kind of modifying it slightly to see if there will be like more of an improvement. Because in the summer, we kind of used a standard American English like utterances that were kind of more scripted as opposed to the African American utterances that were from interviews, so like less structured. So this time we're gonna get interviews with standard American English talkers, and so that they'll both be interviews and less structured, and see if there will be like a difference in that.
Great. And Jason?
Yeah, I think there are kind of many paths forward. So yeah, Jasmine, we're working right now on a second CURS project that expands and kind of contextualizes and check certain aspects of the reliability of what we found over the summer. And one of those, kind of improvements we're making this time around is making sure we didn't want to, in the initial one, do a direct comparison between white talkers, understanding white talkers and black talkers, but that came up as a question in the results because we did see that at the pretest, our listeners weren't understanding black talkers very well, and it did seem to be disproportionately different than our kind of training samples. So we're kind of, tweaking the study a little bit to confirm the finding we had the first time and then measure the degree of inequity or discrepancy between transcription. But I can see if we really do find that this is a helpful paradigm and relatively efficient paradigm, that we could develop kind of a dosage related treatment, so to speak, or intervention or training for folks who do have a high degree of interaction with, particular dialects. We can't, obviously, probably wouldn't put people through training for every dialect that exists in America, but regionally, we know different language variations exist in parts of the country. So I could see, if we, in 5-10 years down the line, see a program where either it's a credential or something like that certain professions, kind of need to have covered. And we aren't seeing that really yet in our field, but our field is actually pushing, a lot relative to cultural competency, cultural humility, equity and inclusion, relative to our assessment practices, relative to our treatment that we offer to our clients who need speech, language, and hearing services. So I could see, something like this moving down that way of making sure that once we send SLPs out in the world, or in this legal example, court transcribers, that they are able to be proficient at transcribing all of the dialects that they would actually interact with and hear.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it strikes me from the description of your findings that it's not even so much about exposure to these dialects. It's really, I think, maybe about like that intentional practice. I wonder if you could comment on that a little bit.
I think there is something to the intentionality, and just devoting the cognitive resources to, even though it's pretty limited, amount of demand of, it's a pretty easy learning task, so to speak, but just devoting intention to listening to the speech of someone who may have a different dialect than you, and understanding what they said. And again, sometimes it can be just that easy of just directing the focus and attention to that. And then the brain kind of does the rest and fills in the gaps, so to speak. So that's one thing I will say, and I meant to say that earlier, is my training's not necessarily as a linguist. And so in our early discussions, I was grappling with some of the background linguistic information, and I have colleagues in my department who are much more qualified and have great training, formal training in linguistics. And so I kind of view this approach to some extent as a backdoor into learning of just kind of using the brain's natural ability to adapt and learn, based on input that we give it.
Okay, well, great. Thank you all so much for chatting with me today. Do you have any last thoughts, anything we've forgotten?
I guess if there are anyone that wants or even is thinking about getting into research, to just reach out. And it's been a great experience for me. And I know a lot of people who are also in research, and they also reiterate the same things. So if you're interested and you know someone that's working in a particular area you're interested in, reach out and see if they are looking for students to work on a project.
Great. Well, thank you all so much. And if you want to learn more about the Center for Undergraduate Research and Scholarship, visit www.bgsu.edu/CURS. Listeners can keep up with ICS activities by following us on Twitter and Instagram at ICS-BGSU and visiting our Facebook page. You can listen to Big Ideas at www.bgsu.edu/BGideas or wherever you find your favorite podcasts. Please subscribe and rate us on your preferred platform. Our sound engineer for this episode was Jacqueline Swartz, with audio editing by DeAnna MacKeigan and Marco Mendoza. Research was provided by Sophia Michalski, with editing by Joe Elia.